Tonight, join me as we return to one of the darkest chapters in human history, where fear, faith, and paranoia blended into a true nightmare. Salem, 1692, a small town carrying a great tragedy. Neighbors turned into enemies, prayers became accusations, and a single dream could be enough to take someone's life. But behind that collective madness lies more than just tales of witches. It is a warning about how easily humanity can lose reason when fear overshadows truth. So before we open the door to Salem, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the secrets I'm about to reveal will make you look at history and at yourself in a completely different way. And if you're watching from somewhere far away, leave a comment to let me know. Where are you from, and has your home ever witnessed its own Salem trial? From this point on, everything in Salem began sliding down an unstoppable slope, a cruel experiment in human psychology that no one ever intended to create. The convulsions and accusations of a few young girls opened the door to panic spreading like an infectious disease. In a community repressed by fear of sin and the obsession with purity, finding a demonic force to blame was almost comforting. It was a chance for everyone to cleanse themselves by burning others. No one in the village realized they were stepping onto a tragic stage built by their own hands. Every accusation, every cry, every forced confession, all blended together into a distorted symphony of fear. The men who were once moral pillars became hunters, while women and children, the weak, became prey. The more people were arrested, the more convinced Salem's citizens became that they were right. The affirmation of the crowd was the strongest evidence in an age that required none. The crowded churches were no longer places of prayer, but theaters. When the possessed girls began to scream and point, the entire room held its breath. Each name uttered, Goody Proctor, Rebecca Nurse, Martha Corey, made hearts tighten, yet no one dared to object. Because in Salem, silence could also be a crime. A single word of defense, even whispered, could earn you the same fate as the accused. So they sat there trembling, watching the tragedy unfold as if it were God's will. And the real tragedy was this. Most of those accused had done nothing wrong. They were simply different. They lived alone, spoke strangely, or were simply unloved. Salem, a place built to worship purity, had turned into a machine that crushed anyone who strayed from the mold. In the cold wooden rooms, interrogations took place with cruelty disguised as justice. No evidence, no witnesses, only words and belief. And in that world, belief was stronger than truth. Tituba, the black woman from the Caribbean, understood this better than anyone. When questioned, she did not confess out of guilt, but out of despair. She realized that truth no longer had value in the Puritan world. Only stories that matched their fears would be accepted. So she spoke. She wove strange images, shadows, spirits, the devil's book, and accidentally created Salem's first cinematic universe. The audience was enthralled. The ministers nodded in excitement. One confession had fueled the entire frenzy. And from that moment, Salem no longer sought truth. They sought witches. Whoever was disliked, different, or dared to question anything became prey for the flames of fear. A wife arguing with her husband? Witch. A man who lost his cow? Witch. A sick child? Witch. Even animals were not spared. Dogs were executed, crops purified, houses sealed. The entire town of Salem became a massive exorcism ritual that no one could stop. Special courts were established, judges in black robes delivering verdicts under flickering candlelight. They believed they were protecting the community's soul, but in truth, they were destroying it piece by piece. Anyone accused had to confess or die. And the paradox was this: if you confessed, you were spared, because your soul had been cleansed. But if you insisted on your innocence, you were hanged, because only the devil could be so stubborn. In that world, justice was completely reversed. Life or death was determined not by guilt, but by how well you could tell a story that matched the crowd's delirium. As for the girls, those who started it all, they had become stars. They were brought to court as living proof of the devil's presence. Whenever a defendant entered, they convulsed, collapsed, and screamed in tears. The audience believed absolutely. They no longer saw a performance. They saw God's evidence. In a society unfamiliar with science, logic had no place. A glance, a word, even a dream could destroy a life. But perhaps the most terrifying thing was not fear itself, but the pleasure it brought. The people of Salem, after years of being suffocated by strictness, had finally found a way to release themselves. They were allowed to judge, to hate, to punish, without being sinful. Fear became a kind of spiritual ritual, a collective pleasure disguised as holiness. And when an entire community united in madness, who was left sane enough to stop it? By the end of the spring of 1692, the list of arrests had grown so long that Salem's jail could no longer hold them. Prisoners had to be sent to other towns. The families of the accused had to pay for food, chains, and even their own deaths. In a place that once believed God was everywhere, now there were only choked prayers behind iron bars. People began whispering in fear. If witches truly existed, perhaps they were not as frightening as we ourselves had become. Salem did not fall because of magic, but because of humanity, because of blind faith in their own righteousness, because of pride that refused to admit mistakes, because of the pleasure of having someone to blame. Those small things combined were stronger than any spell ever written in books. And while the cold wind still howled through the wooden houses of 1692, what truly haunted Salem was not the devil, but the image of humans looking into the mirror and no longer recognizing themselves. By early autumn of 1692, Salem was no longer a village. It was an open-air theater of tragedy where every role ended with a noose. The hysteria had reached its peak. People lived in fear mixed with a sick sense of excitement. Each day brought more arrests, more confessions, more blood, and more prayers for God's justice. But behind the sermons and repentance, Salem was rotting from within, and the irony was not because of the devil, but because of those who were hunting him. The Court of Oyer and Terminer, a name that sounded as grand as if it carried the duty of God, had become nothing more than a killing machine powered by fear. Chief Justice William Stoughton, who believed God spoke through him, needed no evidence, only accusations. In his eyes, guilt required no proof, it only needed to be declared. Anyone who opposed was seen as a rebel against God's will. Salem had become a place where suspicion was a weapon, prayer was evidence, and silence was confession. The prisons of Massachusetts were so overcrowded that prisoners lay pressed together in the cold, without blankets, without food, without hope. Pregnant women were shackled beside sick old ladies. Some died in jail before the court could even read their sentence. Yet the villagers flocked to the trials as if they were harvest festivals. They applauded when the judges announced verdicts. They sighed in relief when someone was hanged, as if killing another person ensured they themselves would live one more day. And in that madness, the remaining townsfolk began to realize, to survive, they had to lie, to confess, to name others, to take part in the collective deceit that was devouring Salem's sanity. No faith remained intact, only fear and despair. The collapse of morality did not happen overnight. It came from hundreds of small, trembling choices when good people chose silence, knowing that truth meant death. Yet a few still stood up. Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer, was accused of witchcraft because he argued too much. When he refused to plead guilty or deny the charge, the court couldn't proceed. They invented a new punishment, pressing him to death with stones. They placed Corey between two boards and stacked heavy rocks on his chest, one by one. After 3 days of torture, the frail old man uttered only two final words: more weight. No confession, no surrender, only defiance in the face of an inhuman system. His death did not save Salem, but it was the first moment when someone said enough to the madness of the crowd. At the same time, cracks began to form within the court itself. Some judges, after witnessing dozens of executions without solid evidence, began to doubt. Whispers spread, if Satan could disguise himself as anyone, could he also disguise himself as the victim? And if so, how could they ever know who was real and who was not? The internal contradictions of the system were exposed, and what frightened people most was no longer the devil, but the realization that they might have killed the innocent. This doubt spread further when some of the condemned began praying and singing hymns before their execution. Instead of confessing guilt, they asked God to forgive those who accused them. The villagers fell into confusion, torn between fear and guilt. When the kindest among them were dying on the gallows, everyone began to feel complicit in a crime. By September, even Governor William Phipps could no longer ignore it. When his own wife was listed as a suspect, he finally realized the hysteria had spun out of control. He ordered the dissolution of the Court of Oyer and Terminer and replaced it with a new one where spectral evidence would no longer be accepted. But the damage was done. Over 200 people had been accused, 19 hanged, one pressed to death, and many others died in prison. Salem was no longer a symbol of faith. It was a symbol of collapse driven by fear. When the smoke cleared, people began to awaken. Villagers avoided each other in the streets. Those who had made accusations began to feel remorse but dared not speak. Ministers cited scripture to justify their mistakes. And the children who once screamed in church now sat silently, haunted by what they had caused. Salem returned to quiet, but it was the heavy silence of guilt and loss. In the years that followed, many officials publicly apologized, but apologies could not restore the lives of the innocent. Chief Justice Stoughton, who once saw himself as the hand of God, never expressed regret. He died with worldly honor, but history remembered him as the symbol of moral blindness. In contrast, names like Rebecca Nurse and Giles Corey became symbols of courage, people who died for truth in an age where truth was burned at the stake. The most terrifying thing about the Salem tragedy was not the existence of evil, but that it was carried out in the name of good. None of them believed they were doing wrong. They thought they were protecting the community, saving souls, doing God's work. And that is the most painful lesson Salem left humanity. When faith loses reason, it ceases to be faith. It becomes a weapon. 300 years later, we still see new Salem trials around us. They no longer hang people, but they remain trials of judgment, where public opinion replaces the noose and social media replaces the courtroom. Salem reminds us that fear and blind faith can turn any community, no matter how civilized, into its own executioner. In the end, it was humanity itself that was the true witch of this story, the one that used fear to burn away reason. And history, as a warning, still quietly repeats the same old question: who will we burn next? From the moment Governor William Phipps realized that collective madness had come knocking on his own door, everything in Salem began to crack. Slowly, suffocatingly, but irreversibly. When the name Mary Phipps echoed through the courtroom, the fiery atmosphere of the war against the devil suddenly went cold, as if someone had drawn the curtain on a tragedy. For the first time, those in power realized that the fire they had kindled could no longer tell the difference between witches, nobles, and themselves. Governor Phipps ordered the trials suspended. But Salem, by then, was addicted to blood and cheering. The fire of fanaticism had burned so deeply that no decree could extinguish it overnight. Villagers protested, ministers hesitated, and the afflicted girls panicked as their audience began to drift away. Some still screamed and trembled, desperately trying to hold on to the crowd's attention. But for the first time since spring, someone began to ask, if Satan truly is here, why would he target the governor's wife? That was the moment Salem awoke, not because of spiritual enlightenment, but because of shame. People realized that every confession, every verdict, every tear had been built upon the fragile foundation of fear and reputation. And reputation, especially that of the powerful, could not be hanged. In October 1692, Phipps ordered the dissolution of the Court of Oyer and Terminer. A new court was formed, this time with clear instructions, no spectral evidence. And just like that, the entire sinful system of Salem collapsed within weeks. Without ghostly evidence, no one could be convicted. Ironically, it took over 100 lives to discover that I dreamed she was a witch was not a valid testimony. But even as reason began to return, the consequences of the hysteria scattered through every corner of the town. Families lost loved ones, children became orphans, farms were abandoned, and churches overflowed with guilt. The prisons, now empty, still smelled of fear and regret. Some of the surviving witches returned, not in the glow of forgiveness, but in the quiet weight of suspicion. They were no longer victims in the eyes of their neighbors, but living reminders of what Salem wanted to forget. The ministers, especially Cotton Mather, began rewriting their own history. In his later sermons, he did not admit guilt. He merely said that Satan had deceived even the most faithful servants of God. That is how history often justifies itself. When the guilty blame the devil they once claimed to fight, and the girls who had been the center of the panic, they vanished from official records. Some disappeared, some left Salem, and a few, according to legend, lived in remorse until their deaths. There were no happy endings for them because no one wanted to remember the main actresses of the tragedy. History only needed them as scapegoats, not witnesses. Months later, Governor Phipps issued a pardon. Some of the accused were released, some bodies were lowered and reburied. But in a society accustomed to fear, mercy was not easily accepted. Many believed that forgiveness was an act against God. Meanwhile, the victims' families began demanding justice, a concept Salem had long forgotten. In the years that followed, Massachusetts courts slowly annulled each death sentence. In 1706, Anne Putnam, one of the girls who had accused dozens, publicly apologized before the entire church. She said that Satan had deceived her. But an apology, no matter how sincere, could not save those who had been hanged because of a collective nightmare. The 18th century passed, and Salem tried to move on, a town with a past no one wished to mention. Yet, like every historical wound, it never truly healed. Historians, philosophers, and even psychologists began to look back at those trials as a mirror reflecting human nature. Because Salem, though it happened more than 300 years ago, is still our story today. When fear is used for control, when truth is replaced by collective shouting, and when justice becomes a public performance. The Salem witch trials were not merely a tragedy of the 17th century. They stand as living proof of how morality, religion, and power can be distorted when turned into weapons. It is a lesson in how humans, in their fear, can become the very thing they despise most. And from those ashes, America began to learn the value of evidence, reason, and skepticism. The principles that seem so obvious in modern society, the right to a fair trial, the right to remain silent, the right not to be accused without proof, were all written in the blood of Salem. When night falls over that small town, the spirits of the 20 executed never truly disappear. They linger, not in the supernatural sense, but in humanity's collective memory. A reminder that any society can become Salem if we let fear lead instead of reason. And perhaps that is the real magic, not of witches, but of memory. Because as long as the world remembers Salem, we still have a chance not to repeat it again. From the damp stone walls where prisoners once awaited death to the neon-lit souvenir shops of today, Salem has come full circle. From a symbol of fanaticism to a global brand of superstition. The town now proudly bears the title, The Witch City, a bustling tourist destination where visitors take selfies beside bronze witch statues, buy amulets made from recycled plastic, and sip potion lattes from cups printed with a cute Satan. No one trembles in fear of ghosts anymore. People only shiver from iced coffee. But behind the smiles of tourism and the glow of festivities, Salem remains a bitter reminder. Fear can be recycled into merchandise, and sometimes into history itself. As you walk down an Essex street, with shops like Hocus Pocus, Witch City Souvenirs, and Coven Cafe crowding together, you can see clearly what the Puritans never understood. Witches never disappear, they just get rebranded. It's a strange kind of justice that history grants. Those once hanged as rebels are now patron saints of a multi-million-dollar industry. Salem has learned to turn guilt into product. The nightly ghost tours take you down narrow alleys where guides in black cloaks whisper about restless spirits. But if you look closely, you'll see that every story is polished just enough to stir emotion without touching shame. No one speaks of the bodies on the gallows or the cries of mothers robbed of their children. Only a safe sort of mystery remains, neatly packaged in a $10 ticket and a hashtag. Perhaps that is how humanity always deals with the past, not by understanding it, but by dressing it up. Salem has not buried its history. It has wrapped it in purple paper and sold it at the souvenir counter. Yet if you pause amid the stream of tourists, you'll feel the strange stillness surrounding what was once Gallows Hill. There are no more gallows, only trees and the sound of the wind. And in that moment, one can imagine the old souls still standing there, not angry, just curious, wondering how their nightmare became a costume party. However, the truly frightening thing is not that Salem has forgotten, but how the world has followed its example. Every time society faces a crisis, we see new versions of Salem. Same formula, different costumes. Fear gets a new label: communists, immigrants, heretics, intellectuals, or anyone who makes the crowd uneasy. And so, The witch hunting wheel turns again, greased by moral confidence. We like to think we've evolved beyond the Puritans of 1692 until we realize that with a few clicks, a public trial can erupt online without evidence, fueled only by outrage. Salem, in its deepest sense, was never just a place. It is a recurring phenomenon, an epidemic of the human mind. In the old days, people believed accusations came from God. Today, we believe they come from righteousness. Both lead to the same outcome. The accused ceases to be human and becomes a symbol of evil to be destroyed. Hanging, then, is just a technical detail. The Salem trials left behind a vast legal and philosophical legacy. After 1692, colonial lawmakers began serious discussions about evidence and the right to defense, concepts no one had thought necessary before. It was because of Salem that America later enshrined the principle of beyond reasonable doubt, that no one can be convicted on faith or fear alone. And it was because of Salem that modern journalism, science, and law were born with a shared vow: never let emotion replace truth. Yet no matter how much we speak of progress, Salem's shadow stretches long across modern culture. It lives in every novel, from Arthur Miller's The Crucible to hundreds of Hollywood films. It is a moral test every generation must face. And the irony is, the more we try to recreate Salem as a cautionary tale, the more fascinating it becomes. Because no one wants to believe that they, too, could be the ones tightening the rope around a neighbor's neck. Perhaps that's why Salem will never rest. Because it isn't just the past, it's a mirror. When you look into its history, history looks back at you. It asks, if you had lived there in 1692, what would you have done? Would you stay silent or would you cheer? And most of us don't want to know the answer. The irony is that while the world debates the biological or political causes of that hysteria, the simplest answer lies in human instinct, the fear of isolation. The Puritans feared being cast out of their community so much that they betrayed reason to remain belonging. And that is the invisible rope we still carry today, the rope of blind conformity. When you stand in Salem Square today watching tourists dressed as witches laugh and pose, it's easy to think it's all behind us. But history never sleeps. It merely changes its clothes. Witch trials no longer happen in churches or courthouses, but on screens and online groups where crowds once again decide who deserves to be burned. And that is the lesson Salem still whispers across centuries. The devil never needs magic. He only needs a community frightened enough to do his work for him. 300 years later, Salem has turned its shame into art, its wounds into products, and unintentionally itself into the perfect symbol of humanity, forever trying to forget its mistakes, yet never stopping from repeating them. So if you ever visit Salem, among the crystal shops and enchanted cafes, remember that the place beneath your feet is not just a tourist site. It is a graveyard of reason. And every time we lose our skepticism, when fear replaces truth, Salem lives again within us. In the northern world, the Vikings understood that true strength did not lie in the blade of an axe or the sails of a warship, but in memory, in the ability to preserve and pass down knowledge through storytelling. The fire in the hearth did not just warm the body, it warmed the soul, keeping the culture from freezing amid the ice. There, every flickering flame was a teacher, and every mother was a storyteller, a philosopher, and the librarian of her lineage. Without books or schools, the Vikings wrote their history with their voices. A story would be told hundreds of times until it became the one truth everyone knew by heart. They understood that for a civilization to survive, it must be remembered, not on parchment, but in human memory. Thus, memory was not merely a skill, it was a duty. When the long Nordic night descended, the whole family would gather around the fire, listening to the crack, crack of burning wood. It was not just the sound of fire, it was the heartbeat of their culture. The mother would speak of gods, traitors, and legendary battles, not to entertain, but to teach her children how to live, how to fight, and above all, how to die with honor. A Viking child learned early that the world was unfair and that sometimes even the gods could not save anyone. But that was not a reason for fear. It was a reason for strength. When a boy heard tales of Thor, the thunder god who struck down giants with his hammer, he did not just learn about victory. He learned that strength must be controlled, that anger could be either a flame or a storm, depending on who wielded it. And when a girl heard of Freya, goddess of love, war, and death, she understood that compassion and power could coexist within a single being. These stories became their moral foundation in place of law, in place of doctrine. In a land where snow buried all traces, only memory remained unburied. But make no mistake, Viking education was not romantic. It was steel forged in fire. Every child was taught to survive before they could read. To speak correctly was to live correctly. A lie could kill the honor of an entire family. Therefore, telling the truth was not morality, it was survival instinct. In a world where every oath could cost a life, language was the ultimate weapon. In Europe at that time, monks copied holy texts in monasteries by candlelight. In the North, mothers carved words into their children's minds with fire and breath. Every lesson was a story, every story a map leading to wisdom. Children learned not to pass exams, but to survive. Because when winter came, there were only two kinds of people: those who knew how to do things and those who were dead. In Viking society, men and women shared both burden and glory. When warriors sailed away, the women at home not only kept the fire, they kept the law. They managed property, negotiated trades, and even took part in local courts. Elsewhere, women were taught to be silent. Here, they were taught to command. They ran the world while the men tried to expand it. A Viking girl grew up in the fire of knowledge, not the shadow of obedience. She could count, bargain, and when needed, wield a sword. She needed no savior, because she herself was the one who saved her family, who saved tradition from being forgotten. And if one day she had to stand before a court to defend her inheritance, she would do so without fear, because her mother had taught her that silence is the first form of defeat. For boys, the lessons were harsher. Every bruise was a teaching, every mistake a rite of passage. When a Viking child threw an axe for the first time, he was not only learning how to fight, he was learning how to take responsibility for his strength. And strangely enough, as they grew, they came to understand that physical force was only the tip of the iceberg. The submerged part, wisdom, honor, and one's word, was what truly earned respect. The Vikings taught their children how to hunt, how to navigate through fog, how to read the wind to predict the weather. But more importantly, they taught them how to read people. At every feast, every sacrifice, the children listened to how adults spoke, when they told the truth, when they lied. Viking children learned to sense truth through intuition, because on the battlefield, betrayal often began with a gentle word. As they grew older, they were sent with warriors, not to kill, but to observe, to learn silence, to endure hunger, to survive rough seas. They learned that true strength was not being fearless, but knowing what to fear. And in that journey, what they carried was not only weapons, but memory, their mother's teachings, their ancestors' stories, and their family's honor. That is what kept Viking culture alive long after their empire fell. They built no statues, wrote no chronicles, they told, and they remembered. The hearth was not just a place for cooking, it was a library, a school, the heart of a civilization. And when that fire died, it still left warm ashes in the memory of humankind. Because just as Salem once burned itself in fear, the Vikings burned their fire for knowledge. One burned to destroy, the other to enlighten. Both began with fear, but only one knew how to turn it into strength. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson the old flame wishes to pass on to us today. In the Viking world, hair was not merely decoration. It was a declaration, a line carved across the forehead by fate. Every strand told a story of lineage, loyalty, and the transformation of a person through the years. A young Viking man, upon stepping out of boyhood, would no longer have his mother braid his hair. From that day on, he had to groom himself, taking responsibility for how the world perceived him. Dirty hair meant laziness. Unkempt hair before the gods was an insult. And when a Viking cut his hair, it wasn't just because of the weather. It was a ritual, a proclamation that a chapter in life had closed. Young men often shaved the sides of their heads, leaving a strip of long hair down the middle as a mark of the warrior. In the pale light of the Nordic dawn, that hairstyle made them look like flames burning amidst the snow. For women, hair was a private treasure. Before marriage, they wore it loose and flowing, soft as ocean waves, a symbol of freedom and youth. Once married, their hair was covered with a scarf or a cloth cap, not out of shame, but power. The hair of a married woman was sacred, meant only for her husband's eyes. a simple act like removing her scarf before others could be seen as an insult or a challenge. For the Vikings, appearance was inseparable from honor. Each morning, before stepping outside, they would bathe, comb their hair, and change into clean clothes, even when the cold froze water in the basin. Saxon records, though biased, had to admit the Northmen may be filthy in battle, but they are far too clean at home. In a world where blood and mud were daily affairs, keeping one's body clean was a way of saying, I am in control of myself. But what set the Vikings apart was not just their appearance, but how they measured their worth through action. When a young man received the family axe, it was not a gift, it was a sacred burden. He carved his name into the handle, not to boast, but as a reminder. From now on, if I fail, my family's honor breaks with this blade. The Vikings believed that tools had souls. Every chip and every rust mark was proof of loyalty. One was never to abandon their axe, even in defeat. A warrior who died without a weapon in his hand was deemed a coward in both worlds, the living and the dead. For women, the coming-of-age ritual was quieter, but no less sacred. A key was given, not only to open the grain store, but to unlock authority over property, people, and destiny. The jingling of keys at a Viking woman's waist was a declaration of power. It rang through the markets, the homes, and the hearts of those who heard it. When a husband sailed away, his wife did not merely replace him, she represented him before the community. She could sign contracts, settle disputes, and even divorce him if he dishonored the family. Viking women did not need to be granted power. They were born with it. And so, when young men became warriors and young women became stewards, one truth was universally accepted. Life in the North allowed no weakness. Yet within that harshness, the Vikings cultivated a rare elegance, the balance between violence and poetry. During the long winters, they composed sagas, epic tales preserved by memory where every line was a lesson. Storytellers traveled from village to village, carrying news, philosophy, and laughter. The children who once sat by the hearth became the keepers of that fire, retelling stories of gods, honor, and human folly. The Vikings understood that physical strength was only half of survival. The other half lay in understanding people. At feasts, a man's worth was not measured by how much mead he drank, but by how well he held his word while drunk. A misplaced insult could spark disaster. Thus, from an early age, they were taught to listen, not to interrupt, not to laugh at the wrong time, and not to boast excessively. Sometimes, silence was the wisest speech. This created a generation with exceptional emotional control. Vikings were not obsessed with blind vengeance, as many modern stories suggest. They believed revenge only mattered if it restored honor. Otherwise, silence, paired with a cold gaze, could shame an enemy for life. In their sagas, some warriors chose forgiveness not out of weakness, but because they understood that only the weak needed blood to prove strength. And when death came, as it naturally did, the Vikings were ready. There were no laments, only stories. When a person died, the question was never how long did he live, but how did he live? If he lived with honor, he would go to Valhalla, Odin's great hall where souls raised their cups among heroes of old. If he lived as a coward, he drifted into darkness, forgotten from songs. That was the true Viking fear, not death, but being forgotten. And so, in every story, every act, every feast, and every cold morning, they fought against that, oblivion. From mother to child, from hearth to sea, Viking education taught that survival was not just about living, but about leaving a mark. A cut lock of hair, a rusted axe, or a handed-down key, all were living memories. And when the long night fell, Viking children sat by the fire, listening to the old tales, knowing that one day it would be their turn to tell them, not to preserve the past, but to prove that they too had lived worthy of it. On the barren fields outside Osaka, the air was thick with the scent of iron and snow. Thousands of spears pointed toward the sky like a frozen forest of steel. At that time, people said that Japan had never witnessed such a vast army, nor such deep fear. Through the morning mist, the Tokugawa banners fluttered, and inside the castle, Yodogimi stood on the watchtower, silently gazing down at the sea of men approaching. She did not weep nor cry out. Everything was unfolding exactly as she had foreseen. To her, peace was merely the silence between two thunderclaps. Osaka Castle then stood as a living symbol of Japanese pride. Towering stone walls, deep moats, and gates designed to swallow any army daring to advance. But Yodogimi knew that the true strength of this fortress did not lie in stone or steel, but in loyalty. In the Great Hall, she walked among thousands of kneeling warriors. They were not men seeking plunder. They were men seeking meaning. Each carried within him the shame of having once been a samurai and now reduced to a shadow in an age of false peace. Yodogimi offered them what Tokugawa could not, an honorable death. That night, torches lit the Osaka sky like a constellation of fire. Generals convened, monks chanted, and outside, the clash of metal rang through the darkness. People believed that even Hachiman, the god of war, was holding his breath. When the first arrows flew, the Japanese winter seemed to stop. The winter siege of Osaka had begun. Tokugawa cannons thundered, ripping through the frozen air. Cannonballs plunged into the moat, exploding in screams and flame. Yet Yodogimi's walls still stood firm. She ordered no counterattack, waiting for the enemy to tire in the cold and mud. In the days that followed, the war turned into a vast chess game. Tokugawa Ieyasu, now over 70 years old, no longer rode into battle, but his mind was still as sharp as a katana blade. He did not need to win by blood. He only needed to make his enemy collapse under doubt. And doubt was the strongest weapon. Spies within Osaka began whispering that certain lords inside the walls were considering surrender. Rumors spread faster than any arrow. Meanwhile, Ieyasu pretended to send envoys for peace, demanding that Yodogimi hand over her son Hideyori to ensure loyalty. Everyone knew it was a silk-wrapped dagger. Yodogimi refused, and the war escalated. In the coldest days, Tokugawa's cannons fell silent. People thought the enemy had retreated, but no, they were digging. Hundreds of soldiers quietly tunneled beneath the moat, placing explosives under the castle walls. When the first blast went off, the earth itself seemed to split open. A section of the wall collapsed, and Tokugawa's troops surged in. Blood and snow mixed into a thick, dark sludge. It was said that some samurai laughed even as they fell, believing that to die at Osaka was the most beautiful death. By the following spring, Yodogimi agreed to peace talks. Both sides signed a treaty. The fortress would be disarmed, and Hideyori would be allowed to live in peace. But Tokugawa did not believe in peace, and Yodogimi did not believe in promises. When Tokugawa's forces withdrew, the people of Osaka saw what they hadn't expected. The defenses were dismantled, but the inner walls still stood. Peace was temporary, and deep down everyone knew the storm would return. In the summer of 1615, it did. Tokugawa's army returned, this time without negotiation. More than 200,000 soldiers surrounded Osaka, cutting off all supplies. Inside the castle, Hideyori, now grown, prepared to fight alongside his mother. Flaming arrows rained upon the fortress like a storm of meteors. Soldiers burned alive on the walls still shouted oaths of loyalty. Amid the chaos, Yodogimi donned her armor, tied her hair, and walked through the fire-lit corridors. "If this is destiny," she said, "then we shall meet again in glory." When Tokugawa troops stormed the gates, Osaka was engulfed in flames. Hideyori fought to his last breath, but as the walls fell, Yodogimi drew her son into the main hall. Mother and son chose to die by fire rather than have their honor cut down by enemy swords. That flame did not merely consume a castle, it burned away the last embers of the age of free samurai. After that battle, Japan truly entered the Edo period, an era of peace, but one built upon ashes. Tokugawa Ieyasu had triumphed, yet even as his victorious army marched into Edo, he did not celebrate. It is said that as he looked upon the Tokugawa banner flying over the ruins of Osaka, he spoke only one sentence: "There is no peace without the smell of blood." In the summer sky, smoke and ash hung over Osaka like a shroud, the sound of war drums mixed with the thunder of cannons as if the heavens themselves were screaming. Inside Osaka Castle, Yodogimi stood on a high tower, the firelight reflecting on her face, proud yet sorrowful. Below her, tens of thousands of samurai and ronin, the last remnants of a dying era, kept fighting, not for victory, but for honor, for the soul of the samurai age. They knew this was not merely a battle. It was a farewell ritual where the spirit of Bushido would blaze one final time before being buried beneath the ashes of enforced peace. With each passing day, Tokugawa's army tightened its grip. They burned the plains, destroyed every granary, cut off supplies, and bombarded the crumbling walls without pause. But with every cannonball that struck, those inside the castle fought even harder. They knew that if Osaka fell, not only would the Toyotomi line be erased, but the very spirit of Japan's freedom would be buried forever. Amid the smoke and fire, Toyotomi Hideori stepped into the castle courtyard. He was no longer the hesitant youth torn between peace and war. His face was blackened by soot, but his eyes burned with conviction. He told his soldiers, "If we must die, let us die as our ancestors lived, standing tall, not kneeling." The cry of "Banzai" thundered across the castle, drowning out even the roar of cannons. Beneath their feet, the ground trembled, not only from the fire, but from the will of thousands who refused to surrender. Outside the walls, Tokugawa Ieyasu watched from a hilltop. At 75, he had seen more than any living man in Japan, and he knew that to create a new era, the old one must be burned away completely. His gaze was no longer angry, but cold, the look of a man who believed he was doing what was necessary. "They fight for the past," he said to his son, Hidetada. "We fight for the future." Yet deep inside, he knew that future would come at a terrible price. In the days that followed, the battle became a nightmare. Tokugawa's cannons fired endlessly. Each collapsing wall brought down blood and dust. The defenders struck back in desperation, from rooftops, from gates, from the dark tunnels beneath the ground. They soaked their armor in oil and hurled themselves into the enemy ranks as living torches. Some said that on the night before the southern wall fell, they heard singing through the smoke ancient samurai songs about loyalty and glorious death. By the 17th day of the siege, fire had consumed half of Osaka Castle. Black smoke rose so high it could be seen from Kyoto. Yodogimi stood before her husband, Toyotomi Hideyoshi's altar, dressed in a white kimono, the color of death in Japanese culture. She knelt, placed Hideyoshi's sword upon the altar, and whispered, "You built your empire with fire. I will preserve it with ash." Then she took her sword and went to find her son. In the great hall, Hideori was waiting. Outside, the clash of weapons fell like rain. Yodogimi looked at him and smiled, the final smile of both a mother and a warrior. She said, "You must not let them see you die in fear. The Toyotomi die with honor, not in pleading." Mother and son knelt facing each other, bathed in the flickering light of the spreading fire. And when the eastern wall collapsed, they performed seppuku together, preserving the family's last shred of honor. When Tokugawa's troops entered, they found only ashes and blood. Osaka Castle, the pride of Japan, was engulfed in flames. Tokugawa Ieyasu ordered the fire extinguished, but no one dared approach. Inside, the roofs were collapsing, and smoke rose like departing souls. When dawn broke, Osaka was nothing more than a dark shadow against a crimson sky. The deaths of Toyotomi Hideori and Yodogimi officially ended the Sengoku era and ushered in the Tokugawa shogunate that would last over 250 years. It was said that when Osaka burned that night, a strong wind carried the ashes out to sea. Fishermen swore they saw ghostly lights drifting along the waves, the restless spirits of samurai who had not yet found peace. Legend says those souls still wander, guarding the honor of the Toyotomi, waiting for the day their country needs them again. Tokugawa Ieyasu's victory was not merely a military triumph, it was the beginning of a new order, a unified, closed Japan entering the Edo period, a world of laws, rituals, and enforced peace. But that peace had no place for people like Yodogimi, Hideori, or the Ronin. They became symbols of a vanished world, where honor was worth more than life, where oaths were written in blood, not ink. Centuries later, the Japanese still speak of Osaka Castle, not as a defeat, but as a reminder that sometimes greatness is not in surviving, but in how one chooses to die. The fire of Osaka did not merely destroy a fortress, it etched forever into the nation's memory a truth that cannot fade. Peace cannot exist if the soul of freedom is chained. And thus, amid the ashes of Osaka, the spirit of the samurai endures, smoldering, immortal, and waiting. After the ashes of Osaka drifted away in the wind, Japan emerged from the sea of fire, not as a victorious nation, but as a soul that had just lost its truest part. That war did not merely bury the Toyotomi clan, it buried the free warrior spirit that had once defined the country. For Tokugawa Ieyasu, this was the beginning of a new order. But for thousands of others, it was the day when Japan stopped dreaming of glory and began learning to obey. In the months following the fall of Osaka Castle, rumors continued to spread across Japan that on moonlit nights one could still hear the echo of war drums from the ashes, that the spirits of the Toyotomi samurai still stood guard amid the smoke. These were not merely ghost stories. They were the collective memory of a nation mourning an era when loyalty mattered more than life itself. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the last survivor of decades of civil war, understood the power of such memory. Immediately after his victory, he issued an absolute ban on speaking the name Toyotomi in any public ceremony. Everything associated with their symbol, from banners to the Paulownia crest, was erased. Osaka Castle, the military heart of Toyotomi power, was leveled to its foundations. Another castle was later built, but not to honor, rather to control, as a reminder that the old empire is dead and only the Tokugawa order may live. Yet, the paradox was this. From the ashes of Toyotomi rose the longest period of peace in Japanese history. For 250 years after the fall of Osaka, no major civil war occurred. The Edo era began, an age of isolation, control, and rigid order, where swords were hung on walls and the pens of bureaucrats replaced the blades of samurai. But the price of that peace was the soul of freedom. Within the warrior class, an emptiness simmered for generations. Those born to fight now had to learn to live in submission. With no battles left to prove their honor, they turned to poetry, the tea ceremony, and philosophy. That was when the samurai spirit began to transform from the warrior on the battlefield to the warrior of the mind. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was rewritten, no longer a blood oath on the field, but a philosophy of order, loyalty, and discipline. The death of the Toyotomi was not merely the end of a clan, but a ritual of transition, from an age of fire to an age of quiet shadow. And if you look closely, you can still find traces of them woven through modern Japanese culture, in the serenity of the tea ceremony, in the mournful no plays about loyalty, and in the eyes of samurai statues at shrines, neither angry nor afraid, only accepting. Some historians say that Tokugawa Ieyasu did what was necessary. After centuries of bloodshed, he brought an end to chaos. But others see in it a subtler tragedy, the tragedy of winning by killing the very spirit that had made the nation rise. To them, Osaka was not the defeat of the Toyotomi, but the suicide of a courageous Japan, a country that chose order over freedom and then learned to live with that choice in silence. The story of Yodogimi and Hideyori later became legend. In Kyoto, it was said that when Tokugawa's men entered the castle, they found only two cold swords beside the intertwined skeletons. An old woodblock print depicts Yodogimi in a white kimono, her long hair falling, her face turned toward the east, where the sun rises, where her husband once dreamed of uniting the nation. In that image, she does not weep, for she understood that sometimes honor lies not in surviving, but in the way you choose to disappear. If you visit Osaka Castle today, nearly everything has changed. The magnificent fortress that stands now is a reconstruction built in the 20th century. Beneath the thick stone walls, people still find old ashes, broken bones, and charred fragments of armor. Many visitors pass by without knowing they are walking over the grave of a dream of a Japan unbound by laws, guided instead by loyalty and the desire to rise. And perhaps that is why the story of the Battle of Osaka never dies. It is not merely a lesson in warfare, but a reminder that every empire, no matter how great, must pay for its ambition. Tokugawa won, but what he gained was not just power. It was an empty kingdom, where silence replaced the sound of war drums, where samurai who once shouted, "honor above all," now bowed before bureaucrats. Japan would take more than 2 centuries to rediscover the soul it lost in the fires of Osaka. When the world reopened in the 19th century and the last samurai vanished in the gunfire of the Meiji Restoration, people finally realized the fire of Osaka never truly went out. It merely smoldered in the hearts of the Japanese, waiting for the day it would burn again, not through war, but through the longing to master their own destiny. When Alexander passed through the Ishtar Gate, history seemed to hold its breath. With every step, the torchlight reflected upon the face of a man who was no longer merely a conqueror, but a king seeking to become a god. And that was the beginning of tragedy. For there is no victory more dangerous than the one over oneself. In the first months in Babylon, Alexander was almost drowned in adoration. Priests prayed in his name. Those who once feared him now bowed in worship. The palace of Darius, a labyrinth of marble and gold, became the temple of ambition. Each banquet was a ritual. Each toast, a crack in the soul of a man who once believed that glory was born only from blood and dust. Alexander was no longer the Macedonian youth who had marched across deserts with his soldiers, sharing dry bread and warm water. Now he wore Persian silk, a crown adorned with jewels, and dined from silver plates once used by Darius. To the Persians, it was a sign of continuity, but to the Macedonian generals, it was betrayal. They whispered in the shadows that Babylon had swallowed Alexander whole, that the warrior's flame in him had been replaced by the incense smoke of the gods. And in those lavish feasts, wine became the blade that severed brotherhood. One night, as wine flowed like a river and music echoed through the palace, Clytus, the man who had once saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus, rose, his voice full of fury. "You may wear the robes of Persian kings, but you will never be one of them. You have forgotten who fought for you to sit here." The room fell silent. Alexander, in his drunken rage, hurled a spear. The steel pierced Cletus's chest. A moment later, the king stood frozen above the blood of his dearest friend, and the grand hall shattered. No music, no defense, only the ragged sound of breath and the silence of a soul that had just stabbed itself. They say Alexander locked himself in his room for 3 days, neither eating nor speaking. When he emerged, he had changed. Not out of remorse, but because he understood that no one would ever dare tell him the truth again. From that moment, Alexander was not just king of 2 empires. He was the prisoner of his own radiance. He ordered strange ceremonies where people were made to kneel before his statue. He declared that the blood of gods flowed in his veins. Historians would later argue, was this the delusion of power or a political strategy to unify the empire? But to those who once loved Alexander, it was the unmistakable sign that the Macedonian hero was gone. And then, while his court drowned in luxury, Alexander once again heard the call of old dreams. The East, unconquered, filled with legends of boundless oceans and the edge of the world. No matter how beautiful Babylon was, it could not imprison a man born to chase the horizon. So he marched again. From Babylon, his army pushed deep into Persia, crossed the Tigris, and climbed barren mountains. But now his soldiers no longer believed in the dream. They were tired, aged, and homesick. On cold nights, they whispered to each other, "Our king is no longer seeking glory. He is running from himself." When they reached the Hyphasis River, Alexander announced his wish to go further, into India. And for the first time, his army refused. Not an enemy, not a plot, but the very men who had followed him to the ends of the earth turned their backs. Alexander stood in the camp, silently facing thousands of dust-covered faces. He understood then that his empire could span continents, but it could never rule over the human heart forever. He returned to Babylon, not as a conqueror, but as a ghost. And it was there where he once declared, "This is the beginning of something greater," that his dream found its grave. In 323 BC, amid raging fevers, Alexander lay in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Outside, the Euphrates flowed quietly, while inside, his generals surrounded him, waiting for his final words. When asked, "My lord, who shall inherit your throne?" he whispered, "To the strongest." Those 3 words, to Kratos, unleashed a storm that would last for centuries. A few days later, Alexander the Great died at the age of 32. A man who had conquered nearly the entire known world, yet could not conquer himself. His body was placed in a golden coffin, carried across deserts, seas, and cities that once trembled at his name. Everywhere he passed, people built statues, lit torches, and sang hymns. But when the procession reached Egypt, it halted. They say a storm rose over the sea, as if the gods themselves refused to let him go further. So Alexander rested in Alexandria, the city that bore his name, the meeting place of East and West, where he had once dreamed of building a borderless empire. And perhaps in that death, he finally achieved what he never could in life: peace. When the tomb of Hephaestion began to rise in the heart of Babylon, Alexander seemed to bury himself within it as well. Not in stone, but in grief and delusion. The city that once gleamed with the gold of victory now wore the colors of mourning. Persian craftsmen, Greek artisans, slaves from Egypt, all worked in silence under the burning sun, building a monument to the man Alexander once called the other half of my soul. People said he was not just erecting a tomb for his friend, but a temple to love, to power, and to the shadow of himself. In those days, Alexander no longer resembled a conqueror, but a priest performing a secret rite. He ordered thousands of animals to be sacrificed to honor Hephaestion's spirit and held ceremonies so extravagant that even Babylon's oldest priests shuddered. He no longer wept, he sang. His voice echoed through the stone halls, blending with the blare of brass horns and the murmurs of the crowd. But the pain did not fade, it merely transformed into obsession. He believed Hephaestion had not left him, that his friend's soul had become a star guiding him to a higher summit. As this religious fervor spread, Babylon gradually turned into a city devoted to Alexander. New statues sprang up everywhere, depicting him as half man, half god, eyes gazing into the distance, hair carved in torch-like curls, holding a globe symbolizing the world. Priests began to invoke his name alongside Zeus and Marduk in their morning prayers. No one dared to object, for everyone understood that if Babylon was the heart of the empire, then the heart of Babylon was Alexander himself. But those who had once marched beside him saw something else. The friend, the commander, the fearless soldier they had known was gone. In his place stood a stranger, magnificent, radiant, and as distant as a god. At royal banquets, he sat upon a throne so high that none dared meet his gaze. He dressed like a Persian king, spoke like a Greek philosopher, and dreamed like an Eastern prophet. When asked where he would go next, he merely looked eastward and said, "There are worlds no one has yet set foot upon. They are waiting for me." By then, his empire stretched from Egypt to the edge of India. Yet to Alexander, borders were an insult. He dreamed of the lands where the Ganges met the sea, set where gods unknown to man await my coming. He ordered preparations for a new campaign, the expedition into India. But this time, the drums of war did not thunder as before. His generals exchanged silent glances. The soldiers whispered, "We have gone far enough." As the army marched eastward, crossing deserts and jungles, Alexander grew ever more estranged from himself. He spoke of destiny, of immortality, of proving that man can become God. He stood amid a storm on the Hydaspes River, shouting in the rain as if conversing with Zeus. Yet beneath the grandeur lay a body breaking down. Fevers, old wounds, and the grief over Hephaestion's death had begun to consume him. The weaker he grew, the harder he tried to prove he could not die. In India, he met King Porus, a foe even Alexander could admire. When Porus was captured and Alexander asked, "How would you have me treat you?" the king replied, "Like a king." Alexander smiled and said, "And so you shall be." In that moment, people glimpsed again the young Macedonian, the man who valued courage more than conquest. But the moment passed as swiftly as lightning. When the army turned back, they were no longer heroes but ghosts. Malaria, hunger, and scattered mutinies claimed thousands of lives. Instead of retreating, Alexander saw it as a divine test. He began to speak of the universe, as though it were a kingdom waiting to be conquered. Some nights, he ordered a tent pitched in the desert, drew maps of the stars in the sand, and pointed, saying, "There, that is where I will go next." When he returned to Babylon in 323 BC, he was no longer the man his empire had once known. The city welcomed him with fireworks and parades, but in the eyes of the people, he had become a living god, and like all gods of legend, he carried both light and darkness. In his final days, he spoke of conquering Arabia and then the entire world. But fate had begun to close its gates. A mysterious fever struck him after a banquet. At first, it was mere fatigue, then delirium, then silence. The physicians dared not touch him, fearing that a single mistake would doom them as it had Hephaestion's doctor. In his last breaths, they say, Alexander did not call upon Zeus, but softly spoke Hephaestion's name. Outside, Babylon still blazed with torchlight, and the Euphrates still flowed, but inside the palace, silence reigned. When he died at the age of 32, the greatest empire on earth was left without a clear heir. The generals stood around his bed and asked, "My lord, who will succeed you?" Alexander gave a weary smile and said, "To the strongest." Afterward, it was said that heavy rain fell and the Euphrates rose high as if mourning him. His body was placed in a golden coffin, and the funeral procession stretched on for days. Babylon was no longer Babylon. It had become a mausoleum of dreams. Alexander's legacy, like a blazing torch, was extinguished at the height of its flame. He had sought to unite East and West, and for a fleeting moment, he did. But his desire to become divine drew him away from humanity. His empire dissolved as swiftly as a desert storm, Yet his name endured, not within borders, but within the imagination of mankind. For sometimes the greatest men are not those who conquer, but those who dare to believe they can transcend mortality, even for a moment. Alexander did not die in Babylon, a Persian chronicler once wrote. He simply dissolved into the stars he believed were his home. When Alexander lay still in silence, the world he had shaped with his will began to tremble. No one could control the storm he left behind, for that empire was not built on laws, but on loyalty to a single man. And when that man died, every brick of it began to crack. Babylon, in the weeks after his death, was no longer the capital of glory, but the stage of conspiracy. The generals who once knelt before him now sat face to face, quietly counting their soldiers, their gold, and their enemies. Each believed he understood Alexander better than anyone else, that he alone was worthy of carrying on his legacy. But Alexander had never left a map for a world after him. He conquered to expand, never to share. His spiritual heirs, men like Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, saw in their king's death not just loss, but opportunity. Ptolemy, pragmatic and bold, understood that power did not lie in the throne, but in the symbol. So he stole Alexander's body, bringing it to Egypt, for he knew one truth. Wherever the conqueror's body lay, that place would become the heart of power. And so Alexandria, the city that bore his name, became a tomb, yet also the final testament to his legend. But legends, once severed from their makers, turn mad. As the generals slaughtered one another for the remaining scraps of empire, thousands of Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, and Indians who had once marched side by side now bled in meaningless battles. The world Alexander once dreamed of uniting through culture and belief now drowned in suspicion. To the strongest, if those truly were his last words, had become a curse for an entire generation. Meanwhile, the people of Babylon, the farmers along the Euphrates, the blacksmiths who once forged his swords, were left only with memories. They said the night sky always glowed to the west, the fires of armies burning one another. And in the desert wind, they sometimes heard the sound of hooves, fast, relentless, then falling silent, as if Alexander's spirit still rode, searching for his final battlefield. His death was not merely the end of a man, but the end of a dream. The dream that one person could bend the world to his will. And that is why Alexander still lives, not in his golden-wrapped corpse, but in every leader, every dreamer, every soul who believes that glory is worth the price of humanity. Babylon has returned to its silence, but in that silence one can still hear an echo, the voice of a man who once thought himself a god and in the end left the world with a single lesson, that even those who touch immortality can never escape the cost of being human.